How can there be a morality if it's changing through time? Slavery seemed as okay back then. Today is like a very much a no-go. If morality is objective, why do moral beliefs change? Plato, I guess, would similarly say that the moral truth was always there, but people didn't see it clearly. So I guess you don't need absolute certainty to live a moral life. Your soul flourishes because of, what would you say, like a moral placebo effect, because you're thinking you're moral when you're actually not, which will be discovered 700 years from now. How can we say I'm a good person? Some people would see me as a good person a long time ago, even if I had a slave or two.
At no point should anyone believe they are wise or they are good. Fools think they're wise. This is one of the attractive elements of religion, the acceptance that no matter what, you will fall short. The only way to avoid that is by withdrawing from society completely and having nothing to do with other human beings. But whether you're a mother or a father or a sister or a judge, whatever, you're going to make mistakes. And the only response to that is to keep on trying.
Wing it to your best ability, so to speak. When we think, our thought is actually a dialogue. We have to let one inner voice dominate. You know, if our voice are conversations, that means that we are ignoring more the other half by only hearing the voice that is more loud, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to make decisions. I mean, we have limited mental energy and attention, so it would be a lot of thinking and analysis paralysis. I mean, you could be growing and becoming less biased, but also at the same time, maybe not really functional. Wanting to really live in truth could be an exhausting for a human being. How do I behave as a good person?
We're always treating each other as a means. Socrates states that the highest good is both good in itself and good for its consequences. So if you said, well, why should I be virtuous? It's the right thing to do. And by the way, there's something in it for you too. Evil is a photographic negative of the good. And the purest evil is just for its own sake. It doesn't, there's no explanation. There are kinds of violence that are useful, and those are not the purest evil. So for example, if I'm robbing a store or something like that, and you come in and I shoot you, that's a terrible, terrible thing to do, but it had a purpose. But if I torture you, that's for its own sake. I am torturing you. We're engaged in an experiment, whether a society can long survive that has no shared criteria of truth. And that's a very serious problem.
How do you know in today's society that you're not mistaking a shadow for a reality, so to speak?
Well, I think that's a very good question.
So what I'm gonna say is,
Great to have you here, everyone. This is the third time we are recording, so this time hopefully it's gonna go well. Yeah, it's not. I'm so excited about this conversation that, like, even if the recording stops, I really want to just continue. Like, I really don't don't care anymore. Now tell me first, what are you up to these days?
Well, these days, I'm sort of semi-retired. I do teach, and I'm teaching Kierkegaard this fall. These are just for different sort of organizations that you can teach online and students apply. I will be teaching, I think, at the University of Texas. But otherwise, I just write. I'm kind of drawing down my intellectual capital by writing articles that use, well, let's say, great books to illuminate contemporary problems.
You seem to mainly explore how ancient thinkers, mainly Plato and Socrates, and the authors of the Hebrew Bible and Talmud, confronted the same, what would you say, moral, religious, and political dilemmas as today. So, showing how their insights can kind of illuminate questions of justice and faith and reason, and the rather fragile relationship between philosophy and society. So yeah, so today we're basically facing the same problems that the ancient Greeks already faced. And what's interesting is that when it comes to these issues or questions, we turn less to religion and more to actually philosophers in Socratic and pre-Socratic Greece. And you've also written a book called The Republic, the Odyssey of Philosophy, where you basically deal with the interpretation of the Republic, from Plato. And now I asked you this question twice before. If you look at the historical significance versus practical use of the Republic, which we will focus on today, if you could distill one lesson, let's say one lesson, from Plato that still applies today and is highly overlooked, what would it be, and why do you think that so many people miss it?
So that's a great question. And it's always astounded me how prophetic the great thinkers are. Um, you can look at Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard in the 19th century, kind of foreseeing many of the political and social issues that we confront today. And I guess I've decided that, there's a way in which philosophy understood as a really deep understanding of human nature and human reality and the conditions of human existence is almost necessarily prophetic. So with that little intro, let me say there's a lot in the Republic that speaks directly to the pathologies of existence in late modernity. If I had to pick one thing, I think I'd pick the cave image because it's just such a wonderful framework to understand so much of what's happening today. So many of your listeners are going to be familiar with the cave image. It's a story told by Socrates in the Republic where he says it's an image of our education and lack of education. And the claim is that we're all from childhood like people in a cave who are chained up. Well, this is just half the people, or most of the people in the cave are chained up. There are some others who are not, but we'll come to them in a second. And we are facing downward. Our backs are to the opening. We don't know that there's an opening above us, and we're watching shadows on the wall that are cast by a few people who are not sitting there chained up, but rather they're manipulating puppets. And these are images, these are animals and human beings and various kinds of artifacts. And there's a fire up behind them that is shedding its light downward in the cave. And they themselves are behind a little wall, so they're holding the puppets over the wall. So all that the prisoners can see are these shadows, and they can't turn their heads. We're told that they're chained by the neck and they're chained by the leg, and they can't move. So they're not even aware of each other sitting next to them, and their entire reality are these shadows that are moving on the wall. And in fact, if anybody makes a sound, sometimes the puppeteers say something. So it's kind of like watching a film. There's a story playing out in front of them. And the audio part of the film is provided by these puppeteers who are saying various things. Um, and so these prisoners think this is the entirety of reality. These are the things that are, the beings that are, as Plato says. And so what is that an image of? Well, I mean, for one thing, I think we can compare it to a film because they're sitting in the dark and they're watching these images. But what they don't know, what the prisoners don't know, is that these are man-made. These are produced by human beings. Uh, and 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 so one question we can ask and we can discuss is what kind of narrative is this? What does that mean? But another thing is that there's no suggestion that the people who are manipulating the puppets up behind them in front of this fire have any idea that there's any opening to the cave or anything outside. This is their whole world. And so I think I'll stop this sequence of remarks just by saying that this is a kind of image of politics and culture as a kind of closed totality in which everybody believes that this is it. There's nothing else outside of this. And I think that that's a very serious problem, and it's something that we're encountering today in many ways. So let me stop there and see if this stimulates further reflection about, what's happening today.
Yeah, and it also makes me think of these online echo chambers, where you get a what do you say? You get to choose your cave because you can choose an online echo chamber that aligns with something that you're already biased towards, right? So you choose your prison, so to speak, and it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, I'm just going to say, I think this is exactly right. And what you're pointing to is a very significant difference between Plato's cave and our cave. So so if we have this, just to go back to sort of the idea that the shadows are a kind of film or kind of narrative, what sort of narrative would it be? Well, for one thing, it's culturally specific, okay? Let me put it this way. There are many, many caves in the world. There's only one world. There's only one surface of the earth that the sun, the source of light and life, shines on. The people in the cave have no idea about this. And this is a kind of image of transcendence, right? What's above us. In fact, the sun for Plato stands for the good, religiously conceived, we could say God. Okay. But they're not aware of this. And so there's a kind of culturally specific story, but it's politically inflected because the puppeteers, where we learn in the cave image, are playing a game. And the game is to acquire honor and power and wealth through predicting what's going to happen next in these images. So what does the story tell? It tells people in a particular cave, these are your gods, these are your friends, these are your enemies, this is what's noble and base and good and bad and just and unjust, right? This is what is blameworthy, this is what is praiseworthy. Now, what you pointed to, Erska, is that in our cave, right, there are many sub-caverns, there are many passages and hallways, and we are very divided. At least in the ancient cave, everyone is watching the same story. So they enjoy a kind of unanimity, right, that we lack because today we've got algorithmic feedback, we've got, let's say, social media, echo chambers, we've got political extremism, we have disinformation and misinformation and political psyops, and a lot of things that we just realized. Elon Musk turned on the feature where you can see where people in X are communicating from, and we realized that many of the folks who pretended to be, let's say, right-wing groypers or something are actually living in Pakistan or something. So we're engaged in an experiment, you might say, of whether a society can long survive that has no shared criteria of truth. And that's a very serious problem.
How do you know in today's society that you're not mistaking a shadow for a reality, so to speak?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And let me say that one of the brilliant things about the cave image is, remember I said at the beginning, Socrates says this is an image of our education and our lack of education. Now, obviously the people in the cave, both the prisoners who are chained up and the puppeteers, are in the dark, quite literally, right, and metaphorically. Um, and everyone's attention is directed toward these shadows. I mean, the puppeteers too are, getting their social status and so forth from their ability to manipulate the shadows. So they're playing this game of power. Um, and the thing about a shadow is it's flat. It's completely internally not articulated, right? It's just a gray thing. It's an abstract shape, if you will. And the meaning of the cave image is that all human experience, at least for the prisoners, which is the vast majority of people, as opposed to, let's say, the power elite, who are these puppeteers, is mediated by the shadows. So Socrates says if there were an echo, it would come from if somebody spoke. If a prisoner spoke or a puppeteer spoke, it's going to echo off the wall. And the prisoners will think that the shadow is speaking. And what does that mean? Let's put this in contemporary terms. They can't even look at each other. They don't even know. There's no direct and immediate contact with other human beings. So it's hyper-mediated. Now, obviously today, our situation is even more hyper-mediated, right? Because it's all electronic, it's online, etc. So what does that mean? That means that I understand my fellow citizens and other people in the society through the shadows that have been projected. So today, we have these abstractions, right? If someone looks at me, they may say white, male, patriarchy, right? Cissexual, whatever these things that they've learned in the university or been told in school. Now, how do you know that you're just looking at a shadow? Well, let's go back to the abstraction. Uh, it's flat and it's abstract and it doesn't convey a lot. That's what these group identities are. But when you get out of the cave, what you realize is reality is three-dimensional. It's colored. You can immediately contact it with all five senses, not just sight. It's substantial. And everything outside of the cave is organically connected in a kind of living world. So one clue is, how much information are you getting? How much concreteness, how much reality are you in contact with? And from that perspective, from the perspective of education, which is getting out of the cave, right? You can begin to understand the deficiency of these other ways of understanding or presenting reality. And I think that's very clear. One of the horrible things about ideology today and always is it's 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 artificial and it's empty. And these categories they don't convey much of anything. They subsume individuals completely in these abstractions. And that's true. I don't care what I don't care if it's Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, wokeness, whatever. But that's the world we live in because the puppeteers have gone online, right? As have we all.
Yeah, I think you put it on steroids when you add this tendency for instant gratification, because you could also say that the ideology is like the antidote to complexity of the world. That's why especially younger people, younger generations are prone to following them, because they really value conveniency and they live on this instant gratification type of thing. And having an ideology is actually a simple answer to a lot of our questions, even the deepest one. I mean, you don't have to do any research if you have ideology. Like all your answers are right there. Yeah. I recently talked to a prisoner who was in maximum security prison for like 2 decades, and he got into a halfway house. And the first thing, and you would think that okay, now you have all the freedom, all the choices that you can make, right? But the average person makes about 1,500 choices a day. An average prisoner in maximum security has 100. So the first time when he went to a grocery store in a halfway house, he got a panic attack because he was so institutionalized into not making choices. It was actually a hassle. And I can see how, on one hand, also coming to reality, starting to do research, starting to see the complexity of the world is like a it's a lot. It can create anxiety in some people. And people are also, we just got lazy, right? We got lazy. So ideology is right there. Um that's why I think a lot of people coming from prison, actually, they a lot of times you see them join these radical groups because there's a story, there's your plan. It's very much simplified, right? Um, yeah,
Yeah, no,
yeah,
I
the
mean, I
lazy
think
human
that
beings.
this is a very important point, and I think that
Is something interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving your goals? Starting therapy can be hard. The right therapist for you may not be in your area. BetterHelp is now sponsoring this podcast. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. With BetterHelp, you can have your therapy session as a phone call, as a video chat, or even via messaging if you prefer that. If you think you might benefit from therapy, consider BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/Captainese. Clicking that link helps you support this channel, and it also gives you a 10% off your first month of BetterHelp so you can connect with a therapist and see if it helps you. Again, go to betterhelp.com/Captainese. Clicking that link gives you 10% off your first month of therapy.
one of the things that you're pointing to is, to go back to the cave image, uh, how does the image as a whole sort of apply to us today? Well, what passes for education today? Socrates thinks that we live in these caves, and every culture, if you like, is a cave, and we're unaware that there's this external world. All right. And real education, which he identifies with philosophy, is getting out of the cave. Now, what does that mean? It means the entire procedure of education is to somehow get out of your chains, and we'll come back to the chains later. Stand up, exercise your agency, move up to the shadows, and I'm sorry, to the fire and the puppeteers. And the first thing you realize, the first stage of education is negative, right? It's, wow, all this stuff that I took to be true is a human construction. Okay. So if you stop there, what are you? You are a relativist. You understand. So now let's say you're a prisoner. You got up there. You're like, oh, I see. This is a game. These people, these few people who are manipulating the puppets, they are deceiving us. They are getting power and honor and wealth and so forth. But what happens if you stop there? Well, your education is truncated. You only have this negative knowledge. And that's sort of where we are today, because much of, for example, higher education today stops there. It says, look, what is society? It's a game of power relations. It is a zero-sum competition, right? And you can if you can look at the charts and you can say, here are the privileged people, right? They're white, they're male, they're this, they're that, they're heterosexual, and then you got the oppressed people. But there's nothing beyond that. And that passes for an education. I mean, you can go to an elite university in Harvard, Yale, or something and graduate with this understanding, and then go out into the world and, write newspaper stories and believe that there's nothing beyond the political. But real education is getting outside of the cave. And so one of the things about the cave image is it shows us our kind of pathetic, crude, um, uh, largely negative education. Uh, and, you know, that I think is something very, very limiting. Totalitarianism is essentially the closing of the cave. It is living within a totality in which everything is decided for you, everything is answered for you. And I think your point about the attractiveness of the simplicity is really significant. And let me add one more thing, and I'll stop because I go on about these things. The chains, right? You pointed out that it's very easy. It's actually kind of laziness to say there's nothing outside the cave. By the way, that's simply a dogma. That's simply dogmatic, right? To say everything is relative, cultural relativism, and so forth. That's just dogmatic because, in fact, you could never actually make that claim. You can't prove a negative. No one can claim that, well, I've been out there, right? I have understood everything that is to be understood, and there's no truth out there. There's nothing that is referred to if you see a shadow in the cave that purports to be God, right? These are our gods. And you say, what is the truth about God? From the relativistic point of view, there is no truth. It's just what we believe in this cave. Um, that's very, very lazy, right? Because it's very easy to say, well, then I don't have to pursue anything else. I now have an intellectual license to play this game of honor and power and the pursuit of all those goods that come through exercising power. And I think that that's a very insidious and bad message, also false, I believe. Um, so you can see why I think this image kind of allows us to analyze and to understand on a deeper level some of the really serious problems in society. I don't think you can have a healthy society unless you have an acknowledgement that there is something above us and beyond us, and that you're willing to listen to people who might have something to say about that.
Right, right. And as far as the universities and everything go, I think that also something that I'd like to add is that I think when you have a bias, a certain bias, we tend to we tend to not allow people to say certain things, right? I think we're doing a great disfavor because I think if, let's say, I have something that is a bias, and I'm not sure if it's a bias, that's something that I need to voice specifically because that's how you construct and deconstruct and try to see if your thesis actually holds. Do you know what I mean? Like, if I have a certain opinion about something that would seem racist or sexist or something, that's the one I should voice because then I can kind of receive, let's say, what I can receive the attack and see if it stands the defense, so to speak, right? So these are the ones that should be put up there, like the most horrible ones. That's just my opinion. Yeah. Now, I want to focus on narratives. And as we said before in our previous not podcast, but the attempts to do a podcast, we think in narratives, right? So if I do this, then this will happen. Usually, so we live in imagination first, reality second. We have a trial and error of thinking. So also, I think I mentioned this before, but dreams can become like a nightly laboratory of insight where you rehearse wisdom and ethical foresight before consciousness awakens. So narratives puts us in someone else's shoes, so to speak. Even though it's us, it's still not us in reality. Like you're practicing a movie, so to speak. We are experiencing consequences that we would, so we get a free, what we say, a free education of what could happen by thinking, right? So that's our natural way of learning. And we also have emotional engagement, which strengthens memory. The neuroscience shows that. It shows that when you activate emotions, the brain actually encodes information more efficiently. So the combination of story plus empathy is a free simulation, so to speak, a free simulation of experiences that allows us to learn from hypothetical situations. So now, as in regards to Plato, his ultimate commitment, as I understand, is to logos, where stories play kind of like a secondary, more illustrative role rather than a philosophical one. So stories are instrumental and not fundamental. And I'm trying to find out if that actually is the case. Did he see the two as separate? And I think it's important for us to know that, because if not, then the stories may not be secondary, but also serve as philosophical tools, and that could lead to misunderstanding of the structure of the dialogues. And on the other hand, if we overestimate the stories and see them as fundamental also, just as the logos, and we don't examine them, then they could mislead or appeal merely to emotion rather than reason, which is precisely what Socrates seeks to correct in the dialogue. Well, I guess that's how atheists read the Bible, right? They say, well, this did not happen. Okay, well, it didn't read it correctly. But do you think he saw them as separate? And if so, how much?
Okay, wonderful question again. Uh, Look, the fundamental fact about the Platonic dialogues can be ascertained by looking initially, I would say, at the literary genre of the dialogues. So what most resembles a Platonic dialogue? And the answer is a Greek drama, an Athenian drama, a tragedy, or a comedy, or a satyr play. Why did Plato decide to write dialogues? Why did he do 35? He wrote 35 dialogues in which Socrates is present in almost every single one. And I would say it's pretty clear Socrates, Plato's teacher, is the protagonist overall of the Platonic dialogues. Why did he choose to do that? And I think the answer is, for one thing, he wanted to present a new model of what it is to be a fully flourishing, educated human being. Socrates. So let's go back. At the end of the Peloponnesian War, or shortly after the end of the Peloponnesian War, Socrates was executed by the Athenians. And here's Plato. And what has happened is this is a 27-year war. It starts in 431. It ends in 404 BC E. And the Spartans take over, and there's a horrible regime called the 30 Tyrants that kills like 1,500 Athenians and does awful things. And then several years after that, Socrates is executed. So it's been a political disaster, and it's been a disaster personally for Plato and for all the Athenians who were attracted to Socrates, who must have been a very, very charismatic man. His great mentor, one of the greatest human beings who ever lived, has been executed. So what does Plato do? Well, he decides, I'm going to make an entirely new curriculum, if you will, and it's going to be focused on philosophy. And he brings to the world stories about a philosopher. Why? So that people could emulate Socrates. And this view, I think, privileges story and narrative. It's not that Plato didn't think that logos was absolutely essential, but what is essential about logos is its role within a human existence, right? Socrates is focused on living the best life he can, on doing the best things that he can. And in terms of logos, there are these things called ideas or forms, the Platonic ideas. And these are transcendent truths, right? There might be an idea of justice or an idea of whatever, courage. And you can see Socrates here trying to live up to the ideas, okay? But what Plato does not believe is that the best life is one of, so to speak, completely leaving the cave behind and dwelling in the sight of the truth like some kind of hermit or monk, and contemplating truth. The point is to bring that knowledge back into your life. So philosophy is a kind of movement of a sort of shuttling movement, right? And this is what makes it so difficult. On the one hand, you want to, by conversation and inquiry, question and answer, through a kind of dialectical procedure, arrive at the best understanding you can, let's say, of the idea of justice. Okay. Now, you never know if you're all the way there, but then you can't stop because you have to take that knowledge into your existence and live a just life. Plato's very clear about this. It's not enough to have a theoretical comprehension, it's to actually live in accordance. This, by the way, is completely consistent with, for example, the Bible, Hebrew Scriptures, Christianity. It's not a question of simply achieving theoretical knowledge, it is actually having a life in accordance with these things. So why does Plato privilege story in terms of the literary genre that he's presenting philosophy in? Because he wants to convince us that we should emulate this life of questing and questioning and trying to live up to our best understanding that we see in Socrates. So that would be the beginning, I think, of a response here. Have never been convinced by commentators who say, well, there's logos, and then there's what they call muthos, the root of our word myth, which means story, fundamentally in Greek. And Plato really likes logos, and muthos is secondary. I dispute that. And I would add one more thing. I wrote a book called Plato and the Talmud, and the reason that I did is because I realized in studying the Talmud, which is this amazing work in which you have stories about individual rabbis who might disagree completely about how to handle poverty or what their attitude toward miracles is or what have you. And what I realized at some point is those rabbinic sages, they were called sages by the rabbis at the time of the Talmud, are also models. And by the way, very much like the Platonic dialogue. So Plato writes these dialogues after the absolute disaster of Athens. The Talmud is produced after the destruction of the Second Temple, when Judaism had lost its center of contact with God, and there could be no more priests and no more sacrifices and so forth. It had to reinvent itself. And it reinvents itself with stories that are similar to Platonic stories, in which question and debate and discussion, and fundamentally the modeling of, let's say, the spirit of the rabbis, of the values, right, is transmitted in story. That, I think, is what's going on in both of those great corpuses or new curricula.
Hmm. Yeah, and he also seemed to believe that we think in this dialogue. I mean, a thought, I guess you can say, is a conversation that you have with yourself. So the dialogue format mirrors the structure of thinking. And there is something about dialogue, because I think we've all clicked on an online article just to read the comments, and just to see how people are debating each other. And sometimes I used to post with closed comments just to see people lose their minds. Why can they not engage in a dialogue? So basically, Plato tries to make you think.
Well, I'm just going to add one thing, because your question about narrative, and I didn't sort of respond to this part, is really about intellectual imagination. Because what you're suggesting is that narrative helps us think through things. And like we find examples of this in the Republic. There's the story of Gaiji's ring, right? Which, again, many listeners will know, which is a ring that makes you invisible. Well, why will they know that? By the way, Richard Wagner wrote a whole series of operas that had to do with a ring of invisibility, right? And then, of course, we have Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And the question is, what happens to you when you put on one of these rings? And there, I think we have to use our imagination. Like, what do you learn? What would you learn, Erska, if you tried to imagine putting on this ring? Would you, as Glaucon, Plato's brother who tells the story in the Republic, claims, would you then rape, murder, kill, steal, do whatever you want? Well, if you think through it, I think you begin to realize that at least some people, hopefully also you or me, can't really imagine doing these things, even if we had the possession of the ring. Because the real question is then, could you actually look in someone's eyes, right, and do these horrible things to them? So y- I do think we think through stories. I do think that Plato thinks we think through stories. But one other thing I want to say is that the intellectual imagination requires contact with reality. You see, if you don't have, let's say you're in the prisoners in the cave and you're looking at abstractions, you don't have that stimulus that's going to get you to try to construct or imagine or think through narratives, to have a better understanding of reality, because you don't actually have any direct contact with reality. You see, I mean, it's sort of, and this is, I mean, just think about this. The great writers are very observant and very rich, and they bring details, and they're great students of human nature. Even Aristotle says this in the Poetics. You have to understand who human beings are, and that implies a very close and direct contact with reality.
In the Apology, Socrates says that philosophy is the examined life, and he says that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. Is that what he means by the examined life specifically?
Okay, so this is very interesting. Um, let's take that phrase in the Apology. It's really wonderful. He says, "The unexamined life is not worth living for a human being." And I sometimes ask my students, I say, "What follows from that?" Okay. And they come up with all kinds of answers. But the correct answer is nothing, because it's a negative statement. The unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. He says nothing about the examined life, although I do believe he thinks that examination of life is important. But the point I want to make here is there's one unexamined life. They're all the same. I believe there are many examined lives. I believe that Shakespeare examined life. I believe that, you know, um, Paul, who did so much to sort of launch Christianity, examined life. I believe the rabbinic sages examined life. I believe that Marc Chagall examined life. I don't care who, Beethoven, whatever. These are ways of examining life. So Socrates doesn't privilege one way, at least not in that statement. By the way, one more thing about the cave image. One of the things I love about it is it's an image of the whole. So you got the cave, and then there's the outside. Now, philosophy, which Socrates sort of exemplifies, is getting outside of the cave on your own power. But what is religion? Religion is, at least the biblical religion, we can't get outside of the cave on our own power. The truth, now understood as God, has to come into the cave at least part way. And that would be revelation. But again, a religious life is an examined life. I mean, what have we got? We have tradition, we have scripture. These are things that have to be studied and reflected on and thought through. You're never going to get away from examining life. And it's an illusion to think that you don't have to examine life. And again, to go back to the point of education today, or what passes for education, it shuts off examination in many ways. I mean, if you teach people, look, it's all relative. There's no, there's my truth and there's your truth, what are you examining? Nothing. You're just engaging in acts of will, postulating. I believe this because I believe it. I believe it because I want to believe it. Um,
Yeah, I do believe that actually religion and philosophy can coexist. As you said, philosophy is like the ascent of the human mind. So the disciplined attempt to know by reason, and you can say that religion is the descent of divine meaning. So the gift of revelation, right? So the philosopher says, "Let me climb to see the truth," and the believer says, "The truth has come down to meet me," right? So for some people, they may seem opposed, but their opposition is very creative, you would say, because when philosophy forgets humility, it becomes arrogance. And when religion forgets reason, it becomes superstition. So they need each other to stay sane, so to speak, right? Yeah, that's very true.
look, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think that it is completely dogmatic to believe that uh, there's absolutely nothing to revelation. There's no God and so forth. But at the same time, the religious perspective can collapse into dogmatism very easily as well. And I think what you've pointed to is the necessity of both of these things kind of informing our understanding. Now, Leo Strauss, the great political philosopher, believed that the tension between what he called Athens philosophy and Jerusalem religion was the spring of Western culture, right? That this tension was a creative and powerful tension. And by the way, we also see it in Plato, because in the Apology, and I take this seriously, in the Apology, Socrates says, well, my friend Chaerephon went to Delphi, and he asked, is there anybody wiser than me, right? And the answer was no. Now consider this. Socrates then says, I ask myself, what on earth could the god mean? Because it is ou themis, it is not religiously permissible, not permissible for the god to utter a falsehood. Okay, that's what he says. In other words, and there's no argument for this. It is a doctrine of faith. The gods cannot utter falsehoods. That means they don't lie, right? And they're never mistaken. That's the article of faith that then Socrates explains launched his entire philosophical career. I mean, if I walked up to Socrates on the street, right? I'm just some nobody, and I say, oh, hey, Socrates, there's no one wiser than you. I don't think he would have any reason to pay much attention to that. But it's because it was the oracle at Delphi where the gods speak. And by the way, Erska, he never names that god. He doesn't know. Why doesn't he name the gods? Because he doesn't know the name of the gods. In fact, in the Republic, he sometimes talks about God, and he sometimes talks about gods. He doesn't know how many there are. He doesn't know what their names are. He just knows that there is something divine, and that can communicate to us in dreams, as you mentioned earlier, right? Through oracles, and in every sort of way. And furthermore, he had a voice that he called his daimonion, his little daimon, his little divine being that spoke to him. So there you have it. He's supremely rational, and yet in his own life, he exemplifies the influence of something like revelation. When the oracle of Delphi says, no, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? No. That's the shortest revelation in history. But it's revelation from Socrates' point of view.
About this, I need to remember. I have a very big question about what you just said. Okay, I will remember it. Yeah. So Plato does seem to be wrestling with this tension between philosophy and the political community. So philosopher pursues the truth, and the community depends on shared beliefs. So he actually believed that society as a whole likes consensus better than the truth.
Yes, indeed. And what's so interesting here is that you can look at the Apology and the trial of Socrates as a kind of exemplary instance of scapegoating. Now, you may recall in the Apology, the charge that Socrates has corrupted the young, and there's also a subcharge, which is he introduces new gods, right? He doesn't honor the gods of Athens, is brought by three people, only one of whom is there at the trial, and his name is Meletus, which is funny because the root of his name is to care, and Socrates makes jokes about how he really doesn't care about anything, right? But when he's talking to Meletus, at some point in the Apology, he brings him up and he asks some questions. And Socrates says, who makes the Athenians better? And Meletus basically says, everybody, all the Athenians, except you, Socrates. You make them worse, okay? Now, this is classic scapegoating. In other words, the claim of Meletus is, if we just get rid of Socrates, it's all going to be good, right? And in a way, what Socrates does is he sets a trap for them. He invites condemnation, and then he goes to his death to show that, yep, he walks the walk as well as talks the talk, right? When he says, I won't stop philosophizing, you can try that, but I'm not going to stop. He shows, no, there is somebody who will not be pushed around, who will not succumb to the social pressure. So to review sort of the gist of this, societies, we look around, and this is part of our being in darkness. What should we believe? Well, what do other people believe? What do most people believe, right? John Stuart Mill writes about this, by the way, in the 19th century. He says, individualism is disappearing. People don't even ask, what should I believe? What do I think? They ask, what is it convenient to believe? What do most people believe? Okay, well, in this case, when times get bad, they look around for someone to blame. And then they use their power. And the power is threat. The threat is, you might call cancellation. The ultimate cancellation is being executed, of course. And just think about Socrates here. He's brought up on a capital charge. Today, that would be like you poured gasoline over a whole family and burned them to death or something. That would be a capital charge, right? Where you could face execution. What a shameful thing, right? What a terrible thing. Most people would never undergo that. But Socrates sort of says, I'm going to be the guy who shows that there is a kind of human being who can stand up to a society, who can stand up to a mob, who have become convinced that I'm the bad thing, I'm the one who needs to be eliminated. And I will show that it is possible to withstand that the individual is stronger than society. And, I I think especially when we lose sight of the traditions, whether they're philosophical or biblical, that inform us kind of how we should live and the sorts of lives that are meaningful and important. When all that tradition is stripped away, we then, I think, are even more susceptible to this mob mentality. And we certainly see that today, right? As you said, it's all on steroids because of the internet.
This question, I guess, is going to be related to forms, or it can be answered by forms. But I, hmm. Okay, Plato. I don't think Plato loved slavery, but he does mention slavery. I don't think he is radically against slavery. How can there be a morality if it's changing through time? So let's say slavery seemed as okay back then, today is like a very much a no-go. So what seemed moral at one time in history, it seemed as immoral today. If morality is objective, why do moral beliefs change? Or I will put it more specifically. Math has always been true before humans understood algebra or calculus or whatever. So then Plato, I guess, would similarly say that the moral truth was always there, but people didn't see it clearly. So I guess slavery is wrong objectively, but ancient people failed to recognize that. I guess you don't need absolute certainty to live a moral life, but your soul flourishes because of, what would you say, like a moral placebo effect, because you're thinking you're moral when you're actually not, which will be discovered 700 years from now. And by the way, prison guards in Auschwitz, many of them, they were seen as normal by the society. I guess, it, yeah, how can we say I'm a good person because I'm doing certain things that in the future may not be seen as good, right? Like some people would see me as a good person uh, uh, a long time ago, even if I had a slave or two.
Yeah, look, so these are very complicated questions. Let me just throw this out. Um, Whatever the moral truth is, um, future and past are in some sense irrelevant to that. That is to say, you know, if I say in the future, I believe X, and in the future they'll believe not X. That doesn't tell me whether I'm right or the future is right. Okay. Um, and so there are several levels of what you pointed out that are worth exploring. One is at no point should anyone believe that they are wise or they are good or that they have absolute certainty. I mean, part of our problem is it's a very strange time because on the one hand we have relativism and on the other hand we have this very strong absolute certainty. So certain, Urska, that if you stand opposed to me on some question that I think is absolutely fundamental, I won't even talk to you. I will just call you Hitler or something like that. Um, but yeah, I'm sure, right? Um, but uh, the so Aristotle actually quotes Hesiod in in the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, his wonderful book on ethics, and basically the point of that quotation, which I won't repeat now, is that anyone that fools think they're wise, right? But the wise don't think they're wise, right? I mean, in other words, this point about humility is absolutely crucial. So keep trying. I take Socrates seriously when he says, I don't know. Now, it's all relative, right? Because you could say, well, Socrates certainly knows a lot more than I do, right? But humility is absolutely essential. And so let's just set that aside. Let's forget about that. But let's talk about slavery for just a minute here. Um, Aristotle, actually in the Politics, talks about slavery, and he introduces an idea, which he calls natural slavery. And what's interesting is I misunderstood this for a very long time, and I think that most people continue to misunderstand it. They think that Aristotle is supporting slavery. Here's what Aristotle says, though. He says, there are people who by nature are not capable of conducting their own lives in the best way for themselves, okay? And those people are what we would call natural slaves. Um, and for those people, it is appropriate to have somebody who is guiding them, someone who is making fundamental choices for them, okay? Now, my understanding of that is this. There are people who are mentally deficient or whatever, and, there are homes where people can, in fact, one of my wife's relatives lived in one of these homes with other men. He was able to hold down a job, but he wasn't completely capable of taking care of himself, and some social worker lived with them and helped them to, make decisions and guided them. That's Aristotle's understanding of a natural slave, at least I think. But in any case, the crucial point to be made is it's actually a critique of the institution of slavery, because it's not as if Greeks acquired slaves by giving people tests and determining if they needed to be guided. They acquired them at the point of a sword, you know? You can read Thucydides about the Peloponnesian War, and the Athenians will enslave an entire male population of a city. So already they're thinking about the morality of this. And I think that one of the things we have to be aware of is that human life is never perfect. There are always trade-offs. You're always doing the best with what you have. And that's also the case with morality, you know? I mean, just consider the phenomenon of war. It is impossible to fight a war without injuring innocent people. If you're going to say to yourself, it is completely unacceptable to injure or kill any innocent people, then you will never fight a war. Okay, well, the next question you could ask is, can you have a society that vows and indeed never fights wars? Well, they will be enslaved, so to speak, right? They will be taken over. So now we have this incredible conundrum. Welcome to human life, you know? So um, I think that the wisest people are the ones who worry about these questions, the most ethically engaged ones. And at the same time, they admit, I mean, this is in a way why this is one of the attractive elements of religion, is the acceptance that no matter what, you will fall short. You will, if you want to put it in religious language, sin. And then what do you do? You know? I mean, the only way to avoid that is by withdrawing from society completely and having nothing to do with other human beings. But whether you're a mother or a father or a sister or a judge or a politician or whatever, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to fall short of your own ideals. And the only response to that is to keep on trying.
Yeah, wing it to your best ability, so to speak. The humility is very important when trying to pursue the examined life, right? Also, when we think, before we said that our thought is actually a dialogue, we have to let one inner voice dominate. If our voice are conversations, that means that we are ignoring more the other half by only hearing the voice that is more loud, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to make decisions. I mean, we have limited mental energy and attention, so it would be a lot of thinking and analysis paralysis. I mean, you could be growing and becoming less biased, but also at the same time maybe not really functional, because you're just thinking, like, wanting to really live in truth and reality is could be an exhausting for a human being. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we try to wing it as best as we can, right? I mean, if you wait for perfect knowledge, you will never act at all. It's what philosophers called, I think, moral fallibilism or something like this. Um, yeah. So yes, yeah. So, what's the short answer to how do I know? Hmm, how do I how do I behave as a good person? What would be a short answer to this?
You guys in the US have a debt that has grown to 1 trillion in the past 3 months, while your economy only grew by 5.5 trillion in the past 3 years. How's that one for you? I can offer you a degree of safety against inflation. You can now be less miserable about the prices, which seem to always rise more than expected, as the inflation just won't go away. Look, the government isn't going to take care of you, so forget the protests and do it yourself. Take matters into your own hands is what successful people do. I decided to help my audience shelter their assets and diversify them into gold, which is something that has always been used by the rich to preserve wealth throughout the history. Birch Gold Group makes the process straightforward. They can help you convert your existing IRA or a 401k account into a tax advantage physical gold IRA without any of the out pocket costs. Just text Captainese to 989898 and receive their free info kit on gold IRAs that is packed with insider information on how gold and silver can protect your savings. I've checked out their references before partnering with them, and their endorsements include Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, and Ron Paul, and I trust these people. With an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, Gold now has 5-star reviews and thousands of happy customers. Birch Gold Group is the nation's #1 gold IRA provider. To learn more, text Captainese to 989898 and claim your free info kit on gold IRAs. You also have the link in the description below.
I guess my best shot at answering that is something like this. It takes others. It takes a community in some ways. So let's take the example of a marriage, okay? You want to be a good spouse. You fall short. Does the marriage end? Not if your spouse is willing to forgive you, right? Or willing to work through with you, right? Okay? So if you understand that we're in this together, I mean, when you said good, you're pointing to an ethical relationship, right? There's no, like, in other words, to be a good person, if I'm Robinson Crusoe and I live on an island by myself, there's not an issue of any ethical good, except maybe in relation to myself, right? I could do injustice to myself or something, but setting aside those things, I'm not hurting anybody else because there's nobody else there. So to to be able to form relationships in which you show some grace for the bad and you show some gratitude for the good, right? And this is part of our problem today is that there's not a lot of grace and there's not a lot of gratitude. Instead of forming these relationships, and it goes back to the cave image, right? Because the people in the cave are atomized, right? They're sort of, they don't know these other people are there and so forth. Now the puppeteers do, so they have a kind of class consciousness as an elite, but that's a whole separate story, right? But they're they're atomized. But today we're even more atomized, and so to be able to interact with other human beings and have a give and take is it doesn't solve the theoretical problem of whether you know what you're doing and it's right. It solves the practical problem, right? And I think that's really, really important. That is to say, it's okay. We all make mistakes. But then the question is, what is the larger endeavor that that community is involved in? Now, in a marriage, it's, maybe having kids and growing old together or whatever. In a society, well, now that's a very interesting question. Because to go back to the cave image, at the least, those prisoners had an understanding of what it means to be, I don't know, a Spartan or something like that, right? In other words, we're all Spartans. We're all in the same thing. And what are we looking at? Well, our film, so to speak, our shadows are telling us that this is a coward and this is a courageous person and this is what a woman should do and this is what a man should do and so forth. What have we got today? If we've got is sub caves and little caverns and we're all in our own little worlds. Now we have a problem as a society. So while it is the case that there are many functioning families and marriages and so forth where there's plenty of grace and plenty of gratitude and plenty of grit to try to continue on, society is another question. Politics is another question. There, I think the knives are out more, than is healthy.
When you speak to, when you say being moral or being good, and this may be a stupid question, but how much is it a matter of the actual purpose of what you're doing as opposed to the outcome? Oh, well, I guess what I'm trying to say is it could it be the case that morality or doing good is always egotistical, but it's just a matter of time frame and complexity to the egoism that makes something seem moral. So, for instance, a psychopath may steal your pen because now he has a pen and that's good for him, but a moral person will leave the pen in hopes of or a wallet, let's say a wallet. They will leave the wallet or give you back the wallet in hopes of making you a friend or making you a colleague, or will not steal from a restaurant that he goes to frequently because it may be good for him now, but it's not good for future him, which is also him. So it could that be just this type of, like all roads lead to Rome. Do you know what I mean? Because when I'm doing something good, I'm always doing it for something that automatically comes back to me benefiting indirectly.
All the great thinkers on these questions have understood this point. I mean, let's just start with Kant, who's often taken as, he's got these principles and, but Kant said very carefully, you should never treat other human beings only as a means, but also as an end, right? In other words, the acknowledgement is we're always treating each other as a means. I mean, if we want to do an ethical analysis of our discussion, right, you could say, well, here's this Jacob Howland guy. Why is he talking to Erska? Oh, because he wants, people to hear his ideas and it benefits him. And why is Erska talking to Jacob Howland? Well, she gets another podcast on the books and people will listen to Captainese and so forth, right? That's fine, because what has always been understood, and this, by the way, is the teaching of both Athens and Jerusalem, virtue is happiness, right? And like, it's amazing. Xenophon famously writes about Socrates. Okay, here's this guy. He's sentenced to death. He's executed. But we have to believe that he is happy, that he died happy. Okay? How did Socrates die happy? Because he was the most virtuous, excellent human being. And being excellent, being good, being just, being intelligent, being reflective, being an open soul, devoting everything you have to living and being prepared to leave it all behind when it's time to die. That's happiness. Okay? So, you know, and let me say one other thing. Plato says, in the beginning of book 2, Socrates states that the highest good is both good in itself and good for its consequences. Okay? So if you said, well, why should I be virtuous? There are two answers. It's the right thing to do, right? Why should I be just? It's the right thing to do. And by the way, there's something in it for you too, right? There is an inner reward that comes with that. Now, the reward may be very thin, right? It may simply be the sense of your own dignity, even though everyone hates you and reviles you and wants to kill you, that you have held true to your best understanding of what is just. That might just be it, right? But that's not nothing. That's not nothing.
It is better than the wallet. Well, and also Plato seems to think that good is not something we invent or make up. I think he sees it as something that we discover by aligning our souls with reality, so to speak. So morality is like a knowledge of the good. And so he believed that people do wrong because they're ignorant, not because they truly prefer evil. So I guess what he meant was if you know what is truly good, you would want to do it, which is sometimes called the ethical intellectualism, right? So Plato thought morality is not an opinion or culture or personal taste. So it's like it's objective, like maths, basically, right? So why be moral? Because it makes your soul flourish, so to speak. And it's about achieving a good life, so to speak. So immorality damages your soul. You may get away with it, but you are internally, what we say, not dysregulated, but unsatisfied. Um, so morality is basically achieving psychological wholeness, you could say. And he did seem to think that knowledge of the good and teaching in general, learning in general, is more like remembering rather than discovering, right? So, like, you have this inner knowledge already that you basically bring out as like a memory. Um, and by the way, you mentioned the Holocaust. Are there particular works of Holocaust literature that you believe that philosophers should engage more deeply with? Um, because if well, because in Plato's view of evil being ignorance, if Plato is right that moral knowledge is like innate but forgotten, How do we then explain the Holocaust? Is it like was it a result of a catastrophic moral amnesia or metaphysical corruption of the soul? And what distinguishes, as regards to Holocaust, the philosophical witnessing of the Holocaust from moral or historical study?
Okay, well, you've only asked some very simple questions, like why did the Holocaust happen and so forth. These are really deep matters. So, first of all, with regard to the Holocaust, I reject any explanations that any explanations, frankly. That is to say, um, if you read a historian like, "Oh, well, they had hyperinflation, and they had, you know, they lost the First World War, and they had this, and they had that." Okay, now here's the problem with this kind of thing. Then you take a leap. Therefore, they had to kill 6 million Jews, right? Like, wait, stop. That doesn't make any sense. So what do we have to acknowledge here? Okay. We were just talking about morality. So one of there's a wonderful um, philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, uh, who was in fact in a German camp during the Second World War, and he's very, very deep and thoughtful, and he loves a passage in what I consider to be the best novel of the 20th century, called Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. Vasily Grossman was a Jew who lived under Stalin, and he wrote this incredible, it's the 20th century War and Peace, right? It's about the Battle of Stalingrad, but has hundreds of people, and it's mostly about life under Stalin. And there's an episode in Life and Fate where at Stalingrad, the Germans have finally been defeated, and there's a Soviet woman who's lost her son, and it's miserable and horrible, and they've captured a German colonel, I think, and people are hitting him and punching him and so forth, and she goes over with a brick in her hand. She's going to hit him in the head. But at the last moment, instead, she sees his face, and she decides to give him a crust of bread. And she walks away, and immediately she says, "Why did I give him that bread? I could have used that bread. This is a horrible situation." Levinas loved this because he said, this is the purest good. Now, by the way, this goes back to our discussion earlier. There's no explanation for it. It's spontaneous. Well, I'll give you an example with regard to the Holocaust. Martin Gilbert, the great Holocaust historian and biographer of Churchill as well, wrote in a book called The Righteous. He looked at all the righteous Gentiles who saved Jews during the Holocaust. And he discovered there was no predicting who would do this, right? There were Nazi soldiers. There were Nazi officers who saved Jews. There were princesses. There were communists. There were Muslims. There were, whatever. The one thing they had in common when they were asked, why did you do it, is that they could not look in the face of the people who came to them for rescue and say no. Okay, so this is a face, right? Okay, so the purest good is like, there's no explanation for it. Same thing's true of evil, in my view. Evil is a photographic negative of the good. There is such a thing as evil. And the purest evil is just for its own sake. It doesn't, there's no explanation, right? There are kinds of violence that are useful, and those are not the purest evil. So, for example, if I'm robbing a store or something like that, and you come in and I shoot you, I kill you to protect myself, right? I don't want any witnesses. That's a terrible, terrible thing to do, but it had a purpose. It had utility. But if I torture you, if I put you on a cattle train car, I lock you in a train for a week, I don't tell you there's going to be no food, I don't give you a receptacle to go to the bathroom in, I don't give you any water, that's useless violence. That's for its own sake. I am torturing you, okay? The Israeli author Aharon Appelfeld wrote a book called The Story of a Life, which is a kind of biography. Appelfeld escaped from a death march, actually a camp. I think he was already in the camp at the age of 10, and lived on his own during the Holocaust. And that book is full of incredible insights. For example, and I believe him, he said, I knew what the safe places to hide in a barn or whatever by the sound of the animals, the sound of the birds. You could tell the character of the people who live there by the sound of the animals, okay? They're just incredible These are incredible books. And finally, Jean Améry wrote a book called At the Mind's Limits. Améry was one of those Jews who, frankly, didn't even know he was Jewish until Hitler told him. You know what I mean? Like, they celebrated Christmas and stuff. And and he went to Auschwitz, and his conclusion was that Auschwitz showed that the intellectual life was complete nonsense, that, you know, the only thing the mind could do was to destroy itself. Very challenging essay. He also wrote a famous essay that's in that book, At the Mind's Limits, on torture and what torture does. Let me say this about Lanzmann, and I'll shut up. There's a scene in Shoah that I think explains why philosophers have not had a lot to say about the Holocaust, because it explodes all of our notions of the ethical internality of the soul. He interviews two Polish farmers who were next door to Treblinka. Okay, 800,000 Jews are murdered at Treblinka. Pure death came, and these guys are talking to him, and they say, "Yeah, we could see it. It was right down there, and we heard the screams at night, and blah blah blah." And he says, well, "How did you feel about that?" And one guy says, "You can get used to anything." And the other guy says, "If you cut your finger, it doesn't hurt me." Now, Erska, if you put these two claims together, if it is true that you can get used to anything, and that if you cut your finger, it doesn't hurt me, then there is no ethical structure inside human beings. I think that's why a lot of philosophers, they don't want anything to do with it, because it just explodes our conceptions. Yeah. Anyway, long answer to a short but difficult question.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. Yeah, they very avoid it very elegantly. So let's say Plato said that moral education is about awakening an inner sense of justice rather than reinforcing the rules. So let's say if the soul has witnessed all things, so to speak, why do you think then the recollection of what's good it can be difficult? Like, does the embodiment corrupt the soul, or does Plato just underestimate the role of experience in like shaping knowledge of morality? And then also, if all knowledge is recollection, what does that actually imply about this intellectual inequality that he talks about? Like, are some souls simply better rememberers, so to speak?
Yeah, well, again, these are very difficult questions. You know, this notion about recollection, first of all, I mean, it shows up in Plato. It's never set forth as, you know, a doctrine that one sort of has to believe in. It's more sort of suggestive. So in the Meno, Socrates tells the story. He tells Meno, you know, he says, here's a story. And then he says later, like, I hold to this story or something like this, you know, that the soul sees everything before it's incarnated. And then, of course, in the Republic, we have the story of the souls choosing new lives. But remember, in the Republic, they drink of the water of in the plain of Lethe, forgetfulness, before they're incarnated, right? So he doesn't just have recollection. He also has this mechanism of, and so his answer to your question is, some people drink too much, right, of the water, and some people don't drink as much, right? And the ones who don't drink as much, you know, remember better, which is a way of saying, I don't know, you know, I don't have an answer to why some people are better rememberers than others. But I think this notion of, you know, recollection is kind of prophecy in reverse, right? Like, or let's say the doctrine of the notion of recollection makes it possible for you to explain, let's say, intuition, right? I mean, you know, we have intuitions that are then often proven correct, and we say, well, where did that intuition come from? You know, like, I thought he was lying, and it turned out I was right, or something like that. You know, it's hard to say. But these are all explanations that are trying to get at, like, how do we know stuff before we know it? You know, how do we even know where to look, you know, when we're asking questions? Yeah. Yeah. So I don't think these are, you know, they're not like they're not strictly speaking logos, you know, as a definite account. They're sort of more vague, you know.
Right, and also, now this is the very last question because you mentioned where to look. I remember you also seem to use Dante's Ninth Circle of Hell as a metaphor for modern society. So, especially like these isolating effects of social media, and for everyone in Inferno, the deepest part of hell is not the fire, but ice, where everyone is like frozen and silent and completely cut off from one another. So this can easily resemble society in today's world. So people are isolated, unable to truly communicate, and sort of like trapped in a state of social atomization, right? And Lucifer himself is stuck in the ice with faces that can look in multiple directions. So, if I understand correctly, modern social media could be seen as like a frozen, isolated, surveillance hellscape where people lose connection and basically also speech, much like Dante's Ninth Circle. But could it be that the disorientation you describe is actually a sign of like a cognitive adaptation? So humans learning to navigate massive amounts of information rather than a like a frozen hellish paralysis. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the most fundamental problems of our society is this question of information. So much of it is unreliable, and so much of it is frankly deceptive. You know, it's um, intentionally false and manipulative. Um, so this goes back to this question of like, what are our criteria of truth? How can we sort through this stuff? And one simple mechanism is to just draw lines. And frankly, even just for personal health. I mean, I know people who don't look at the news. At some point, you'll just sort of take a vacation. Like, I'm not going to look at the news for a week. I'm not going to go on social media. I'm not going to do this. Because as Jorge Luis Borges realized, the wonderful Argentinian author with his short stories, every story is about the effects of infinity on human beings. What happens if you hit your head and you can't forget anything? What happens if you gain ultimate insight? What happens if you live forever? What happens if the boundaries that, you know, hold us in place, the walls around us that kind of make sense of our world, what happens if they're removed? And I think that's a very serious question. And I think today we have this flood of information, of very questionable quality. And, you know, unfortunately, it just makes it more difficult. And I think that, people want to retreat from reality. Like, if you say to them, well, then you just have to step up your game and start sorting through stuff more carefully, and you try to inform yourself more and learn more, you know. Kierkegaard says somewhere, most people want an education, then they want to stop, right? Like, you get a degree, you're educated. You don't need to read anything else. And he says Socrates is like a guy with an open wound. That wound's never going to close. He's going to keep going. As long as he can draw a breath, he's going to question and think and discover. But that's a difficult position to be in, and it's unpleasant to people. Um, and I think many people just say, I'm not going to do it. Well, that's why they embrace these theories that explain everything, right? Like, here's a solution, right? And the solution is, I don't know, whether it's left-wing extremism, right-wing, here are the people who are to blame, right? It's the Jews, or it's this, or it's that. And, you can make sense of everything this way.
Yeah, the real horror of Dante's Ninth Circle isn't like the ice or the silence, but it's more like nothing in hell can face the right direction anymore. So Lucifer's misorientation is like a final consequence of a world where every act every act of betrayal unthreads the fabric of meaning until even up and down become indistinguishable, right? So and his ice is solid and ours is liquid. You said that right. So we have an endless flow of information that paradoxically freezes us in place. So in the world where Lucifer's head points toward the world, yes, he sees it falsely. Like, the danger isn't that we're cut off from one another, is that we're connected in ways that disorient us even further, so to speak. So the true horror isn't isolation, is disorientation within the connection, right?
And we have to
And
keep
yeah,
moving. Dante and Virgil can go across the circles. Everyone in every particular circle is stuck there. They can move through. And if they keep moving, and that's the wonderful thing about this, They can break through the ice, and then they're reoriented, right? Down becomes up, and they can understand that Lucifer was upside down, right? And what's ahead of them, then they move toward the light. And that's the cave image. And that's why we need to make sure that our society always maintains some sense of there is an opening, there is something above us, and we need to keep questing for it.
All right, now tell me, where can people find you?
That's a good question. I mean, I have this kind of pathetic website, really pathetic, but they can email me
No,
there
it's
anyway.
good. It's good. It's good. It's good.
Anyway, it's jacobhowland.com, I think. I think that's it. I'm pretty sure. You can see how attached I am to this. I don't know. But anyway, if you can see a little bit about me there, I haven't updated it. There's a lot but just Google, I should say, I publish a lot in Unheard. I publish a lot in City Journal. I've got something coming out in Tablet. I've done various things, and you can kind of, the New Criterion, bunch of articles. So you can find me online.
All right. Thank you so much.